Great.
Okay, so thank you for joining us, everyone, for the Dane4Dogs Law and Policy event. This is a good way to have students and people from the community learn about things that matter to Dane4Dogs and that matter just more broadly in the field of animal law. We have a very special guest with us today. Delcianna Winders is a professor at the Vermont Law and Graduate School. She has quite a well-established background in the field of animal law, doing clinical work, doing real world work on behalf of animals, including with causes Dane4Dogs is interested in. We'll hear a lot more about what she's doing. We have some questions scheduled later on in the meeting about her own career and ways that we could get involved in our careers. But first of all, I want to turn it over to Professor Winders, who has a presentation to share with us.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. So yeah, let me just share my slides because I can't multitask. All right. Can you see those? Excellent. So we're definitely going to have time to chat at the end, and that's the part I'm always most interested in. But also, please jump in if you have questions as we go. Sometimes it can be easier to answer them in the moment, and I'll try to pause periodically to check in for questions, but also feel free to just unmute yourself and ask a question. I'm not always great about seeing hands when I'm talking, so just unmute. We're a small group, should be fine. So what I want to talk about today is animal welfare and the law. Before we get into that, I'm briefly going to talk about the Animal Law and Policy Institute at Vermont Law and Graduate School that I direct. But then we'll get into it. So I'm going to start with a discussion of our key federal laws that pertain to animal welfare, namely the Animal Welfare Act, the Health Research Extension Act, the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, and the 28-hour law. And I'll talk about some shortcomings of those laws. From there, we will talk about some key state laws, which are really quite limited. So we'll talk about state cruelty to animals laws and why it's so challenging to use those laws against institutions that exploit animals. And so in that context, I'll talk a little bit about the Ridgeland case. I'll also mention state confinement system bans. Then we'll talk about local laws. And that, frankly, is where we've seen a huge amount of progress in the last decade or so. And those laws really focus on banning practices rather than just trying to regulate them. So I'll talk about those. I'll bounce back briefly to state laws, and then I'll open it up so we can have a discussion. So starting with the Animal Law and Policy Institute. So I joined the Vermont Law and Graduate School faculty about 4 years ago, specifically to establish the Animal Law and Policy Institute. So a long background practicing, teaching, writing about animal law. And the Institute has a mission of training tomorrow's animal advocacy leaders to advance animals' legal status, and we do that through education, scholarship, policy development, community engagement, and litigation. So we offer multiple degrees. We're very student-centered. We really see ourselves as a training ground, and all of our degrees are available both residentially and online, or a combination of those two. So first, as a law graduate school, we of course have the JD degree, both online and residentially. You can do that with a focus in animal law. And then we have a Master's of Animal Protection Policy degree, which is something I wanted to create for a very long time because a lot of the work that I've done over the last 2 decades as an animal law lawyer didn't necessarily require a law degree. Some of it does, litigation, advising clients, but a lot of it, particularly the legislative work, lobbying, regulatory work, you don't need a law degree to do that. And so I wanted to offer that training to folks who were more interested in that aspect of things. And the truth is, law school doesn't always train you super well for that. So that's why we have the public policy degree, and that can be done on its own, or it can be done in combination with the JD degree. Next thing I wanted to mention, which is open to students in all of our degree programs, is our Farmed Animal Advocacy Clinic. So a law school clinic is kind of like a mini law firm where the students are the lawyers. And so student clinicians, the students in the clinic, in the Farmed Animal Advocacy Clinic represent clients in real world matters, and they're matters that are focused on improving the treatment and status of farmed animals. So we really prioritize matters that have the greatest potential impact for farmed animals, but also the greatest potential learning opportunities for students. So we try to hit the sweet spot. And then, as much as possible, we also try to amplify voices of underrepresented humans who tend to be those who are disparately impacted by factory farming, industrial animal agriculture. So students in the clinic develop a large range of advocacy skills. It's not just litigation, they do policy work, regulatory work as well. And those are, of course, important skills for advocating for farmed animals, but they're also transferable to all other types of advocacy, animal advocacy and beyond animal advocacy. And the students in the clinic are participating in every step of the way, from interviewing clients, or potential clients, drafting documents, working with experts, sometimes arguing or testifying. So that's a really, really unique and powerful opportunity. Last thing I will mention is our summer program. So a lot of schools kind of go quiet in the summer. At Vermont Law Graduate School, in some ways, we're busier than ever in the summer. We have a very robust summer program. Summer is also a beautiful time to be in Vermont. So the centerpiece of that are our summer classes, and those classes range from just a weekend intensive all the way to 3 weeks long. Right now, most of them are 1 week long classes. And you can see there's a very wide array of classes. I want to take like half of them myself. I'll just highlight a couple animal law related ones. Quite a few of them are related to animal law, but undercover investigations is one of our most popular classes. And a lot of students say it's their favorite class that they take during the whole time that they're here with us. We also have an animal welfare science and ethics class, and that's taught by a veterinarian who is an animal advocate. And importantly, you don't have to be a student at Vermont Law Graduate School to take these classes. You can be a student at another institution, including an undergraduate student. And if folks are interested in learning more, I'm of course happy to connect with you. In the summer, we also have visiting media fellows. So we'll have 3 animal law media fellows. We have visiting scholars. We have a Hot Topics talk series. And so there's a lot going on. And it's a great just community to get to be a part of, whether it's for a weekend or a few weeks. So that's the Animal Law and Policy Institute. I will pause here just to see if there are any questions. Okay, seems like no. So I will get started with our discussion of federal laws related to animal welfare, starting with the Animal Welfare Act. So the Animal Welfare Act is really our main federal law governing, as the name suggests, animal welfare. And it covers 3 key areas of animal use. It covers animal experimentation, the breeding of animals for the wholesale pet trade, and animal exhibition, so circuses, zoos, that sort of thing. There are some big problems with the Animal Welfare Act. The first is what it covers and what it doesn't cover. So, as you may have noticed, a really big area that it does not cover is raising animals for food. The vast majority of animals who humans interact with are animals who are raised for food. We may not realize it because they're kept behind closed doors, and there are a lot of mechanisms at play for us to not think about the fact that we are eating animals. But most animals we interact with are animals raised for food. And a lot of people are surprised to learn that there is not a single federal law governing how you can treat animals while they're on the farm, the majority of their lives. So that's a big hole in the Animal Welfare Act. The next is how the act defines animal. And so it only covers warm-blooded animals. And warm-blooded, cold-blooded is not a scientific category. It's also not something that has anything to do with how sensitive, complex, intelligent, etc. animals are. So a lot of animals are excluded right out of the gate. Fish, octopuses, and other cephalopods, for example. And then rats, mice, and birds, they're warm-blooded, but they are excluded when they're used for animal experimentation. And they are by far the largest number of warm-blooded animals used in experiments. And we don't even know how many precisely because they're excluded. But the best estimates of rats and mice are more than 100 million every year in the United States. So you do have about more than 2 million animals who are still covered by the Act at around, I think, 12 to 14,000 locations. Problems there. First, the standards are really minimal. So the way the Animal Welfare Act works is if you're engaged in a regulated activity, research, wholesale pet trade, or exhibition, you're subject to routine inspections. And what those inspections are checking for is whether you're complying with minimal welfare standards. And I'll just give you one example of these minimal standards. So this is the standard, the space standard for dogs. I will give you a few seconds to read that and see if you can make any sense out of it. It is not very straightforward. It might seem scientific in some way because it's so complicated. But really it's pseudoscientific. And what it actually means, and this is from the US Department of Agriculture's website, that's the agency that enforces this statute or is supposed to, is that dogs need to be kept in cages that are about 6 inches longer than their bodies, not including their tails, and then 6 inches taller than their height when they're standing. The USDA says this is based in common sense. It obviously gives the dogs barely enough room to turn around, to lie down in a clean spot. That this lack of space often causes stereotypic behaviors. So circling, for example, which is a well-recognized sign of poor welfare. And a lot of dogs are allowed to be kept in solitary confinement, despite the fact that we know that they're extremely social animals. And many, many dogs are, particularly those in laboratories. And if you double this space, so twice the amount of space as the dog's body size without their tail, then you never ever need to even let the dogs out of the cages to exercise, to have access to the outdoors. So really, really minimal standards. We know that animals need more than this to have good welfare. But even with these minimal standards, when people violate them, Animal Welfare Act enforcement is very, very poor. So the US Department of Agriculture's own Office of Inspector General has issued audit report after audit report after audit report over the course of decades, condemning the agency's failure to meaningfully enforce the Animal Welfare Act. And one of the big things that they've flagged is that when the agency finds an entity, which is already very unusual, they discount the penalty. And so on average, the Inspector General found in one audit report that looked specifically at research facilities and specifically at serious and grave violations, violations that led to things like animal deaths, and found that penalties were discounted by 86% on average. And so that means for every dollar in potential penalties a violator faced, they paid just 14 cents. And so the USDA has repeatedly said that this results in violating the Animal Welfare Act being treated as a, quote, cost of doing business. Some of my work has focused on the fact that the USDA relies primarily on warnings as so-called enforcement mechanisms. It's not really enforcement. They're just saying, hey, stop doing that. And when people don't, they more often than not don't do anything. So there's a really big enforcement problem. I wanted to flag there was an Inspector General audit report specifically focused on dog breeders that came out surprisingly. I didn't expect it to come out, but it came out in February. And its key findings were that 80% of dog breeders had not fully corrected previously cited violations. The USDA and APHIS, the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, is the sub-agency of USDA that handles the Animal Welfare Act, did not timely respond when it received animal welfare complaints. And so the Inspector General concluded that APHIS's inconsistent and untimely inspections may have contributed to continued Animal Welfare Act violations. And as a result, continued violations were posing a threat to the safety and well-being of the animals. You probably noticed the redactions here. They've redacted the number of facilities they looked at. That is not something that has happened ever before, and it's really bizarre. So that's a very high level overview of the Animal Welfare Act. So I'll have you tuck that away, but I will pause again to see if there are any Animal Welfare Act questions before I move on to other federal statutes.
We have a question from the in-person group here.
Great, thanks. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I might have missed this, but when was the Animal Welfare Act established, and has it been updated since?
Yeah, so it was first enacted in 1966. It has been amended periodically over the years, not recently in any meaningful way. So in 1970, it was originally enacted just to govern a small category of animals and research and suppliers of research animals used for research. In 1970, it was expanded quite significantly to include exhibition and the wholesale pet trade. And then in 1985, it was amended to try to improve things for animals in laboratories. So it was amended to require addressing the psychological well-being of primates. And this was because of an undercover investigation that was quite damning. It also was amended at that time to require exercise for dogs because the USDA had been insisting to Congress that dogs didn't need exercise. There was no evidence that dogs needed exercise, and so Congress had to force the agency's hand. But that was really the most recent significant update to the Animal Welfare Act, and that obviously was quite some time ago. The exclusion for rats, mice, and birds was in 2002, so that is also quite significant. And that was just done through the Farm Bill, so it wasn't even a freestanding bill. It was just somebody slipped a line into the Farm Bill, which is hundreds and hundreds of pages long.
Wow, that's crazy. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
You say there's a lack of oversight. Has funding been cut substantially given this recent administration's DOGE cuts?
Yeah, so interestingly, I am not aware of any cuts to the USDA's Animal Care Division, the division that implements the animal welfare. Animal care is part of APHIS. And so we haven't seen any reduction in the number of inspections yet. Of course, I imagine it's just a matter of time. I will note that the USDA itself has not been very aggressive in seeking funding. So in some years, the agencies put together their budget requests for Congress. So ultimately it's Congress's decision, but the agency asks for what it wants. And in some years, the USDA has asked for less money to enforce the Animal Welfare Act. And in some years, it's been quite a while, but it has asked for $0 for Animal Welfare Act implementation. So one theme since 1966, when the USDA told Congress it didn't want responsibility for the statute, a recurring theme has been a real lack of interest in implementing the law. And I think that's largely because the USDA is principally an agency who promotes American agriculture and supports American farmers. So it doesn't see itself as a traditional regulatory body that's supposed to oversee facilities and take action against them. Anybody else? Okay, I am going to continue on our way. So, one important thing I wanted to mention about the Animal Welfare Act, it does not preclude states or local governments from having more protective laws. And that's really important, as we'll see. It is very explicit in the fact that it does not do that. The next federal statute is the Health Research Extension Act. So this law was actually enacted in 1985 alongside those amendments to the Animal Welfare Act that I just mentioned around animal experimentation. And so what this law does, it only pertains to federally funded animal experiments. But the US National Institutes of Health are the largest funder of animal experiments in the world. And it's something on the order of $20 billion a year. It's a very significant portion of the NIH's budget. So it's not an insignificant number of animals impacted by this. And the Health Research Extension Act applies to all vertebrates. So it reaches more animals than the Animal Welfare Act, including rats, mice, and birds, zebrafish, who are very widely used in experiments, but not cephalopods. There are some efforts ongoing to try to get them recognized. But what the law does is it has recommendations, recommended guidelines for animal welfare. And in theory, if you don't follow those, you're supposed to be subject to losing your federal funding. The reality is that that almost never happens. And so there are lots and lots of federally funded research institutions that are not paying very much attention to animal welfare. And just to give you one example, there are 7 national primate centers that are federally funded at universities across the United States. You all are probably aware that there's one in Madison. And all 7 of these have really horrific records. They all have records of negligent primate deaths, primate escapes. Madison might have the worst record of them all. So like escape after escape after escape. So if nothing else, that's a public safety concern as well. But the monkeys also are very frequently injured when they escape. So they have suffered lacerations. Many of them have had to have digits, fingers, or toes amputated because of injuries happening while they're escaping, partly because fights will sometimes occur. One lost part of their tongue, another had to have their whole tongue amputated, face wounds. Other incidents include multiple incidents where monkeys' feet were closed in the cage door, and that too has resulted in digit amputations. Other incidents that have required amputations, attacks and injuries with cage mates, and then being returned to the same cage with the attacking animal, failing to provide monkeys water for at least 4 days. As a result, all of them needed IV fluid and one ultimately died. Just this February, the USDA cited UW-Madison's lab for failing to give post-surgery painkillers to 8 monkeys, and also allowing monkeys to injure one another. And 2 monkeys were injured by things in their cages. And yet the lab continues to receive federal funding. That is interestingly on the line right now. So they were part of the National Institutes of Health's funding cuts. They're part of litigation challenging those funding cuts. And so they have at least temporarily had that funding restored. And we'll just have to see how that shakes out. But federal funding of animal research is probably the only area federally where there's actually some hope and some positive activity going on right now. I saw a hand and then it went away, or I can't see it anymore anyway. Was there a question?
I do.
Yeah.
Hi. I don't have my video, so I apologize, but I just wanted to ask you that I am very passionate about wanting to get rid of animal testing. And I have been working on this as a campaign, on my own. I hope you don't mind me giving you a moment of your time there, but I am a current terminal cancer patient.
Oh my goodness.
that's how I came to learn about animal testing.
Wow.
And what I found by reading tons of articles, I mean, a lot of scientific, medical articles, that scientists are not putting the dots together, that monkeys or animals that we just don't compare. Our bodies, our physiology do not connect. And I'm really distraught about that. I go through, a couple of the other organization, Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine is one of them. They talk about how they're using new humane ways of doing things and technology. So what I'm getting at is I feel like kind of frustrated knowing that I'm very sick myself, that I'm on different medications that have made me so ill, being a cancer patient. And I know that I am one of probably so many people out there who have cancer or different neurological problems. So how can we get more awareness through legislatures or the government? When I write letters, or if I perhaps make phone calls, they don't really acknowledge them, which is really sad. I don't see how. I feel very frustrated when I want to help change the laws as a citizen. I care very much. I love animals, but I know that they're doing things backwards because we're not seeing how the human body, we're living in the skin we're in, you know, like
Yep,
I'm not, I hope that makes sense.
absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. I just, I care about human health care and I care about animals, and the two just don't mix. It's really sad that um, I don't think that out in the public eye that people see scientists as, I don't want to say the right wording, as if they have all the answers, but it's been quite evident to me that there's some people, some scientists are awesome, very intelligent, and then there's others that are very arrogant who, don't mind killing, I hate to say it, but putting it bluntly, killing a bunch of animals just for the record, for their studies. And that's not what we want. We don't want limited studies because our bodies don't match to a body's physiology. So, what do we do about that? How do we get awareness out there to the public and to legislators to realize that this is not working and we need to put investments into new modern alternatives in medicine for human health care?
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for your concern for animals despite your situation. It's the great irony, if you can even call it that, that we justify testing on animals by saying they're different from us, and then also say, but it's still worthwhile because they're similar to us. And as you alluded to, we metabolize things very differently than animals. And so just with drugs in particular, the failure rate of new drugs that go through animal experiments and are approved for clinical trials based on those animal experiments, the failure rate in humans is well over 90%.
Yes, yeah.
So I'm glad you mentioned Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. They're doing really outstanding work on this front. The other organization I will flag is White Coat Waste, and they're really focused on the removing federal funding piece and have had some really good success and are really aligned with the current administration. And so if you're not familiar with them, I would check them out. I don't know if there are like regular demonstrations outside the primate lab there. I know at some of the other ones there are. And I think you, given your situation, could be a really amazing spokesperson. And I'd be happy to chat further about this offline.
You
If
do?
there's
Oh
like
my gosh, I
more
would love you.
guidance. So yeah.
I already do, but I need even more.
Yeah, so I have a slide with my email address at the end, but I'll just put it in the chat now so that you
I
have
don't
it.
mean to seem strange about it, but I have such a passion for it. I've worked so hard, and um, any of your advice, I really appreciate it. And because I love your advice already, the two organizations you mentioned, but also that the NIH is like almost impossible to communicate with. They're very rude, and I think
Yeah,
that's terrible. I think that the people have a right to speak, and I vote as much as I can. So great, great. Thank you so much for being so understanding. All right,
of
thank
course.
you.
Yeah. Um, okay, so that's the Health Research Extension Act. So I'm gonna pivot now to two other federal laws, and these laws are focused on farmed animals. So I said early on that we don't have any federal laws governing on-farm treatment of animals, but we do have laws that govern transportation of farmed animals and slaughter. So starting with the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. That law is supposed to ensure humane handling at slaughter and humane slaughter, which is defined to mean animals are rendered unconscious before they're shackled up by a leg and have their throat slit. One big issue with this law is that the US Department of Agriculture has interpreted it as not applying to birds. And birds are the vast majority of land animals that are slaughtered for food every year. More than 9 billion with a B birds, chickens specifically, are slaughtered for food in the US every year. And in the USDA's view, the Humane Slaughter Act does not apply to those birds. In addition, the Office of Inspector General even adds to pigs, cattle, sheep, those animals who are covered by the law. The Inspector General has also found enforcement problems with this law. In addition, this law preempts state or local laws that do anything different from the federal law. And so, for example, when California tried to ban the slaughter of downed pigs, pigs who are too sick or injured to stand or walk, or even to prohibit slaughterhouses from receiving downed pigs, the Supreme Court held that they could not do that. It was preempted by the Humane Slaughter Act and the Federal Meat Inspection Act. Those two laws work together. And we still allow the slaughter of downed pigs. We allow them to go into our food supply. But importantly, to the extent a state or local law provides the exact same thing as the federal law does, the state or local authorities can act. And this is all very brief. I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm just trying to give a high-level overview. So the 28-hour law is quite an old law. It's been on the books for more than 150 years, and it governs transportation, as I said. I really think it should be called the 36-hour law. So what it says is you can't transport an animal for more than 28 hours unless you stop for food, water, and rest. But it says if the owner of the animal or the person in charge of the animal authorizes it, you can do that for 36 hours without stopping. Enforcement of this law is also very, very poor, worse than the Humane Slaughter Act or Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. In decades, the only so-called enforcement of the 28-hour law that I have seen is a couple warnings. So it's on the books, but it's not really enforced in any meaningful way. So that's the general landscape federally when it comes to animal welfare. And so, of course, that's not enough if you're concerned about animal welfare. And so we turn to the state level. And at the state level, the primary laws we have are cruelty to animals laws. And every single state has a cruelty to animals law. It's a little bit different in each state, but there are a lot of commonalities across the states. And these laws are, great for the person who beats a dog or puts a kitten in the microwave. They can apply readily in those situations. But when you're talking about more institutionalized cruelty or even egregious cruelty in an institutional setting, it becomes very hard to use these laws. So first, they're criminal laws. They're not civil laws. They don't provide for licensing of facilities. They don't allow for inspections. And so right there out of the gate, you're limited. You're limited in getting access to information. All of these, activities, if we're talking about animal experimentation, factory farming, slaughter, that's happening behind closed doors. And so you're going to have to rely on whistleblowers and or undercover investigators to get any evidence of violations of state cruelty laws. And increasingly, states are passing what are called ag-gag laws to try to make it even harder to get inside facilities or to disclose what you have observed inside facilities. Because they're criminal laws, they also have what are called mens rea requirements, state of mind requirements. So you have to show not only that somebody violated the law, but that they did it with the requisite state of mind. And it varies by state, but it could be you have to show that they did it intentionally or they did it knowingly. It's not enough, for example, to show that they did it negligently in most instances. You have to prove all of this, the violation, the state of mind, beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the highest possible standard of proof. And, that's for good reason, because we're talking about potentially incarcerating people, but it makes it very hard when you consider the fact that we don't have inspections. It's very hard to get eyes on these animals. Then on top of that, there are exemptions to the state cruelty laws. So one very common exemption that about half of the states have is for common farming practices. The exact language varies, but it's something along the lines of common farming practices are exempt. I think it's really important to recognize that that doesn't mean that farmed animals are completely written out of cruelty codes. And I have an article coming out about this. You still need to show that the exemption applies, but it makes it that much harder. Another exemption, and this relates to the Ridgeland case, a lot of states have some sort of exemption for animals who are used in experimentation. So Wisconsin's exempts teaching, research, or experimentation on animals if it's done by an approved institution that's regulated under the Animal Welfare Act or the Health Research Extension Act. And it also exempts bona fide scientific research if these are animals who are not regulated by federal law. And that's a pretty broad exception. It's broader than some of the other exceptions that you see for animals in laboratories. A lot of them will say if it's not done in compliance with approved protocols under the Animal Welfare Act, and that's something that has happened at UW-Madison, for example, is they have protocols and they're not even following their own protocols when, for example, they neglect to give painkillers to animals. Another thing that makes state cruelty laws really hard to apply to institutional settings is that they're very, very broad. They tend to prohibit things like unnecessary cruelty or unjustifiable torment. And you might think that's good because it captures a lot, but it becomes problematic when you have such a broad law in a criminal context, because there's some constitutional protections that criminal defendants have. I don't want to get too in the weeds with legalese here, but basically, the constitutional right to due process includes being on notice of what's prohibited by the law. And so if a law is too broad, it may be interpreted as unconstitutional for failing to put people on notice of what is prohibited. And then the last one is a big one, and it's also implicated in the Ridgeland Farms case, and that's prosecutorial discretion. So state cruelty laws are enforced by prosecutors. They're not enforced by private citizens, and prosecutors get to pick and choose which cases they bring. And typically, they're going to bring the cases that they think they're the most likely to win. And they're also not going to bring cases against probably facilities, for example, that are employing a lot of people in the community. And in our legal system overall, prosecutorial discretion is considered sacrosanct. It's something you can't really challenge. If a prosecutor decides not to do something, you're pretty much out of luck, except in a few jurisdictions, and Wisconsin happens to be one of those. So Wisconsin has this incredible law that says if the DA refuses to issue a complaint, a criminal complaint, a judge can allow that complaint to go forward if the judge finds there's probable cause of a violation. And refuse here has been interpreted very broadly as just declined or not even declined, but just sat on a matter. And so this is really incredible. And that's the procedural mechanism by which Dane4Dogs and Simple Heart were able to go to the court and persuade them to issue a criminal complaint. In almost any other jurisdiction in the United States, they wouldn't have had that mechanism available. So that's how the Dane4Dogs case came to, sorry, the Ridgeland Farms case came to be. Are folks generally familiar with the facts of that case, or should I run through them quickly?
I think one thing that we might like to hear a little bit about was what you contributed to the special prosecutor petition, and then your current thoughts on the trajectory of the case.
Yeah. So my role pertained directly to that exemption that I showed you. There's this very broad exception for research facilities, and Ridgeland Farms is both a research facility and a breeder of animals for experiments. And that's not unusual. A lot of the biggest research facilities are also breeding and selling animals for experiments. And so the expert report that I wrote for the Ridgeland matter was basically laying out for the court that this business has actually two different businesses and breaking down how they are regulated differently. They're physically separate, all in order to establish that things that happen at the breeding side of the business, which is where the vast majority of the thousands of dogs are, do not fall within this exemption. That those dogs are fully subject to the state cruelty to animals law. And so it took me many, many pages to explain that, because I explained how the Animal Welfare Act treats research facilities and breeders differently, and you have to be regulated as both. I'm not going to get into all of that now. Happy to answer questions about it. But that was the focus of my report, because one concern is they were going to try to say, well, we're a research facility, so we're just completely exempt from the cruelty law. And you can't say like, oh, I'm researching on some animals over here, therefore, whatever I do to any animal anywhere is exempt. But that was a very big concern. And I think it's an argument that's probably going to be made as we move forward. So this is one of the arguments that I think we're going to have to grapple with going forward. Happy to talk more about that in the Q&A, but I want to just cover a few more things. So the next is the other category of state laws that I wanted to mention. So cruelty laws are the main ones, but an emergent one is bans on certain confinement systems. So I already mentioned that most of the animals we interact with are those who are raised for food. 99% of those animals are raised on factory farms in intensive confinement, in situations where they don't have enough room to stand up, lie down, spread their wings, turn around, where they're subjected to a slew of mutilations without any anesthesia to prevent them from harm or make it less likely that they harm one another when they are so tightly crammed together. And so in the face of the lack of federal laws and the limitations of state cruelty laws, states in 2002 started banning one or more of the confinement systems that are really constitutive of today's animal agriculture. So on the left, you see a veal crate. This is where most calves used for veal, who are byproducts of the dairy industry, because they're males, they're not going to produce dairy, and they're a different breed than those used for meat. So they are used for veal, and to keep their flesh tender, they're prevented from moving around through crates, as well as being chained by the neck, as you can see here. The next category are battery cages, where most of our egg-laying hens are kept in a situation where they have less than a letter-sized piece of paper to spend their entire lives. And then the last one are gestation crates for breeding pigs that are 2x7 crates that, particularly as they become more and more pregnant, they're not able to move around in. And so states started banning these systems. And at this point, 15 states have banned one or more of those systems. And then, in addition to banning the use of those systems within the state boundaries, states started enacting sales bans, meaning that even if a product was made out of state, if it was made using one of these confinement systems, it couldn't be sold within their state. And as you may know, national pork producers sued California over that and lost in the US Supreme Court. The US Supreme Court said no, states can say what conditions they want products being brought into their state are raised under. So that was a really monumental victory. There is now an attempt to gut that legislatively, since the industry was unsuccessful at the Supreme Court. So just reintroduced a couple weeks ago. This was previously known as the EATS Act, the Ending Agricultural Trade and Suppression Act. It's now going under the name Food Security and Farm Protection Act. And this is an outrageously broad law that would prohibit state and local governments from imposing any standard or condition on pre-harvest production of any agricultural product that is sold in interstate commerce. And so the intent is to gut California's confinement ban and similar confinement bans elsewhere, but its reach is much, much further. It would reach laws addressing pesticides, genetic engineering, labeling, drugs. It's really, really broad. So that is something to keep an eye on, because that could really set the animal protection movement back quite significantly. And so I encourage you to contact your senators in opposition to this. It's not been introduced in the House at this point. So that's really it on the state level, with a few exceptions, but for the most part, that's state animal welfare regulation. And then we have local. And I said that's been a site of a lot of progress over the last decade or so. And interestingly, the local law progress has been mostly in the form of outright bans, rather than regulating industries, saying, you know, here's the cage size you can use. It's just banning certain practices. So one are retail pet sale bans. So about 500 local jurisdictions have enacted a ban or limitation on selling cats, dogs, and rabbits. That's typically the category of animals. There are some exceptions that go further, but banning the sale of those animals within their borders. And that's in part a reaction to the USDA's failure to regulate the pet trade, as well as our pet overpopulation crisis. States have said, local governments have said, you know what? If you want to be offering animals to the public, you need to offer adoption. And there are at least 13 local jurisdictions that have done this in Wisconsin. I don't think Madison or Dane County are on that list. And these local laws can trickle up to the state level. So at this point, this started out very much at the local level. It continues to be primarily a local movement, but 8 states have since adopted this on the state level. I know a bill was introduced in Wisconsin a few years ago. I don't know the current status of those efforts or if they are ongoing, but that's one example. Another big category of local success is restrictions or bans on traveling wild animal acts. And so here again, hundreds of local jurisdictions have banned all or some wild animal acts. So elephants, tigers, and circuses. I mean, when I started working in animal protection, I didn't think we were going to see the end of wild animal circuses, and we're still not quite there, but we're pretty close. I mean, we used to have like hundreds of elephants crossing the country, and it's down to just a few at this point. And Dane County was a very early leader in this space. So in 2012, more than a decade ago, Alliance for Animals got a ban on elephant acts at county-owned facilities in Dane County. Like the retail pet sales bans, this too has percolated up to the state level, such that 11 states now restrict or ban traveling wild animal acts. And so we are starting to see more progress on the state level once you have a groundswell at the local level. One area that has been principally at the state level but takes the form of a ban, like the ones that I've just described, are bans on products, cosmetics products made with the use of animal experimentation. So 12 states have banned the sale of cosmetic products made with animal experimentation. And once you've got that many jurisdictions doing, I mean, honestly, I think it would have just taken one or two if they were large enough, like California, which is one of the states. Companies are just going to change their practices across the board. So they're not having to like say like, okay, here are the non-animal tested cosmetics that we'll send to these states and here are the others. So even if you accomplish something in a limited number of jurisdictions, its impact can be much broader. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing the slides so that I can see those of you who are on camera. And so we can hopefully just have a conversation. But there's all of my contact information. Happy to communicate with you by email or whichever way you want to. On the right is more general information about the Animal Law and Policy Institute. So let's chat.
Well, I can start off. First of all, thank you so much for that presentation. It's very comprehensive, a lot of really valuable information for all of us, I think, regardless of what our career prospects are, what career we're currently in. But I guess like for me and the other students, I'm curious to hear about how you initially got into animal law and what kinds of opportunities you found useful to establish yourself in the field.
Yeah. So I've been an animal advocate since I was about 14. I loved animals from my grandma told me that I used to like walk when I learned to walk, I used to stare at the ground so I wouldn't step on any bugs. But I don't think that's unique. I think kids like animals. And then I had some, well, I could tell you. I had some pigs who I had bottle raised and they were companions and they were unexpectedly to me slaughtered. And so that sent me to the library to read everything I could about animals, animal rights, factory farming, and I became vegan and an animal advocate then. I think it would have happened sooner or later, but that certainly expedited things. And then I ultimately decided to go to law school because I knew I like arguing, researching, and writing. And so I thought, okay, let's use the law to advocate for animals. I also knew that the law was failing to protect animals adequately. I don't think I understood until later on how much the law not only is exempting the animals who suffer the most, but is actually proactively facilitating their exploitation. So that's something I've come to understand later on. Opportunities, I've had a lot of amazing opportunities along the way. I've had some incredible mentors without whom I wouldn't be where I am. And I think like one of the most important things is just seizing opportunities when they present themselves. I could not have like all of my jobs over the last decade plus, I couldn't have anticipated them. They're just opportunities that came up. And so I took the opportunities. I will say, I think networking is huge if you want to work in this space. I think that's true for any field, but it's especially true when it's still a relatively small field. And so I got involved, for example, with the American Bar Association has an animal law committee. I was in law school in New York City, so the New York City Bar had an animal law committee that I got involved in, and relationships I made there in the New York City Bar have helped lead to pretty much every job that I've had since I graduated.
And you mentioned that you're helping form another graduate program for people not interested in law school. And I'm just curious, what do you think are other high impact careers that people can pursue, or high impact means of like volunteering if they have a job not related to animal advocacy?
Yeah, it's a great question. The first thing I want to say is I don't think there's any one right or best way to be an animal advocate. Like sometimes I've talked with people who are like, "Oh, I think being a lawyer is like the best way." Um, I don't think that's necessarily true. It is one way, but if you don't enjoy being a lawyer, you don't enjoy the things that being a lawyer entails, I don't think it's a good path for you. I think there's going to be a path for you that you are going to enjoy. And that is important, in part because you're an animal too. And also because we want you to advocate for the animals for the long haul. We don't want you to burn out or just, give up on it and turn to something else. And so I really think figuring out what your skills are and what you enjoy doing, and then trying to figure out how you can translate that into animal advocacy is the best path. And animals are everywhere. Our exploitation of animals is everywhere. And so you can find something no matter what it is that you enjoy doing or are really good at doing. Hopefully a combination of those two. That said, I do think law and policy is a really rich space. And I think that's in part because our laws are how we codify our values. And if we don't codify them, then they could just be a fleeting trend. And so if we want meaningful animal protection, we need to have it codified in law, and it needs to be enforceable. That's a really important piece of it because, as I talked about, we've got a lot of laws on the books, but they're not adequately enforced. And so that's a big piece of it. But I think veterinarians can do a lot to advocate for animals. A lot of veterinarians are working for industry, and we need more who are working for animals. I've met some really great veterinarians. I've hired veterinarians as part of my teams in past jobs, and it can be quite hard to find veterinarians who want to do this work, and that skill set is really important. Scientists in general, science is critical for supporting animal advocacy, and we need more scientific experts. So those are a few examples, but I don't want anybody to think that those are the only ones.
You mentioned veterinarians. What do you think about Dr. Crystal Heath? She has been ostracized basically by other veterinarians, disallowed from participating in conventions. And I've seen some of the letters and smears written against her. How would you tell somebody in the veterinary care industry to get involved, given that?
Yeah, so and for those who aren't familiar, Dr. Crystal Heath runs an organization called Our Honor that has been very outspoken on behalf of particularly animals used for food. And she's done a lot of work documenting animals who've suffered because of depopulation from bird flu. And so, yes, she is on the cutting edge, and she's trying to make it easier for people who are in veterinary school now to carve this, to have this path. It's not a direct analogy because I did not suffer the level of harassment that she did. I've been sued by industry. I've been banned from places, but not the level that she had. I've had threats on my life, but none that I took that seriously. But I was told even by my mentors that animal law wasn't a thing. That wasn't a career that I could do. One of my mentors even put it in my letters of recommendation, I found out years later. And so part of what I'm trying to do is make it easier for people to pursue this pathway. And I think she's trying to do that. It's at earlier stages in the veterinary community. And the veterinary field historically has been very industry dominated and very male dominated. That is shifting now, but we're still in the midst of it. And so I think one does have to have thick skin if they're going to put themselves out on the front lines the way that Crystal has. But that's not the only way of doing it. So a veterinarian is teaching our animal welfare science and ethics course, and I see that as a form of advocacy. You're training advocates. She's also done expert reports in a number of matters, testified both in legislative hearings and court hearings. So there are different ways of doing it, but I don't want to make it seem easy.
Are there any other questions?
I did want to put something else in the chat because I think I know it was on the list of questions. I'm sorry if you asked it and I missed it. But there was a question about like internship opportunities. And we at the Animal Law and Policy Institute actually are maintaining a list of both job opportunities and internship opportunities in animal law and policy, broadly speaking. So they're not all things that require you to be a law student or to have a law degree. So I'm putting a link to that in the chat because there isn't any other resource that's comprehensively gathering this information at this point. There's some that have limited info, but we're really trying to pull it all into one place. Our website is not awesome, so you have to scroll down. Even with that jump to the careers section, you're going to have to scroll past a list of jobs that our alumni have in animal law and like some other info, but then you'll get to the list of job opportunities and internship opportunities.
That's super helpful. Thank you for telling us about that.
Yeah.
I guess before we're done, I just want to confirm again, any other questions or comments, or I have one final one to close us out. Oh,
I'm just gonna make a comment for Dane4Dogs, the nonprofit. Speaking of needing to scroll all the way down to websites, similarly on our website, you're able to add yourself to sign up and get our information. I'm sure many people here got an email. This is the student group, of course, group's event. But if you would like to get involved with the greater nonprofit, feel free to sign up. We've got plenty of events coming up, and I know there's some people that are passionate about getting involved. So, and I really, thank you for your time. I really appreciate how you were talking about how figure out what you like to do and match that to animals, because I think a lot of time earlier in my career, I was constantly trying to put myself in an area where it's like, should I be doing this? Like, I'm a tech person at heart, a problem solver. And I thought to myself, okay, maybe I can become a lawyer. I can kind of force myself into these areas. But we need people who can write letters to the editor, talk to boards, social media gurus. Like, we need everybody in this
Totally.
movement for any reason. So just get good at, we need TikTok stars. We need people that get attention and can edit videos. Like, we need anything, fundraisers, lobbyists. Like, there's anything you can do. So find what you like to do and match that to helping animals.
Absolutely. And another resource folks might want to check out if you're not familiar is Animal Advocacy Careers, which I think is trying to help people identify what might be the best pathway for them.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Animal Advocacy Careers, I'm pretty sure is what it's called. Let me double check. Yeah, Animal Advocacy Careers. So they have a job board as well, but the more resources than that. And I'm recommending them more for the other resources.
I have a question.
Yeah.
This is more like broad sweeping, I suppose, but I was particularly surprised to hear about the fact that some states have banned the sale of cosmetic products tested on animals, because just a few years ago there was like an opposite precedent where anything sold in China, for example, was required to be tested on animals. And so I was just wondering in the scope of your career and maybe your life as an animal advocate, do you feel satisfied and or optimistic in the direction that things are moving and the speed with which things are becoming more recognized?
Satisfied? No. Optimistic? Yes. And that is, to my understanding, that is still the case in China. And so I think, and China has got, very rapidly growing consumer market, including factory farming. They buy a lot of meat and poultry from us. That export market is one of the main reasons that they want to speed up slaughter here in the US. The tariffs obviously complicate that in some ways that are maybe helpful for animals. But I am optimistic. I think maybe I have to be to keep doing this work, but I am. And part of what makes me optimistic is the students that I work with and students like you all. More and more people are seeing these issues and seeing how they interconnect with other social justice issues. Although I guess we're not supposed to say social justice anymore, but interconnected exploitation. Um, and there has been progress made that I didn't think I was going to see. Like really small things, but for many years, I headed up PETA's Captive Animal Law Enforcement Division. So we focused on animals in circuses and roadside zoos. So I did a ton of work on captive elephants. And I said before, the progress there has been really amazing. I remember the day we decided we were going to start tackling cub petting, and that was seen as something that was just like so widespread. The players were so entrenched that wasn't going to be something you could tackle. And now that is federally illegal and not happening anywhere. And as a result, we don't have hundreds, if not thousands, of cub, juvenile tigers being disposed on the black market because they needed a constant supply of cubs for cub petting. I was working on bears in concrete pits, and I recognize that none of this is on the scale of factory farming or even animal experimentation. But I remember Ingrid Newkirk saying to me when I was fairly early on, like, if people are paying money to go look at a bear in a concrete pit, how can we expect them to stop eating animals? And so I do think we're going in the right direction. It's not fast enough, no, but it's in the right direction.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think that's a great note to end on. Always great to be optimistic. Keep
Yes,
working
it's
hard
important.
for animals. Yeah. All right, Professor Delcy Winders, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Hopefully some of us will get in contact with you in the future, talk about more opportunities that exist. And for anyone that isn't familiar with Dane4Dogs, you can visit dane4dogs.org to find out more information about the work we do and get in contact with us. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Everybody, bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.